Hi, everybody. Thank you for all being patient. We are going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Yvonne Cappel-Vickery, and I am the Clean Energy Organizer at the Alliance for Affordable Energy. And for those of you who don't know, the Alliance for Affordable Energy is a consumer advocate that works in New Orleans and at the state level advocating for clean, affordable, and reliable energy. So I spent a lot of time obviously talking about renewable energy with some of the panelists that joined us today, and also with regular folks who ask me similar questions. And we often get into the same conversation of what are the barriers? What's the holdup? Why does Louisiana not have a lot of renewable energy developments? And so there's a lot of answers to that question, and they are ever evolving. And so that's kind of why we put together this webinar today, is to, start answering the question of what has been the barriers to renewable energy development here in Louisiana. So just a couple of housekeeping notes. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function, and we will share those with panelists. If we are not able to get to your question today, we will share the question with panelists, and then we will get you a response and share that with you. Also, so I'm sure a lot of you are interested. Obviously, you've chosen to spend your Thursday evening with us. So we will be sharing this presentation in the future. We will be emailing a link to this presentation, which will be housed on the Alliance for Affordable Energy's website. So we will email all of you that and email you any information that might come up during this webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome our first panelist, Kate Muspell. They are joining us from the Center for Planning Excellence, and will kind of be teeing us off to talk about land use, siting barriers, and kind of best practices. So thank you so much, Kate, for joining us.
Thank you, Yvonne. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm excited to get into this topic. I work at CPEX. CPEX is the Center for Planning Excellence, cpex.org. You can see in the corner of the slide right there. And we're a nonprofit. We're Louisiana's only planning nonprofit. So we do urban planning work across a lot of different fields, industries. It can sometimes relate to transportation or housing, economic development, all sorts of things. And one of the things that we do focus on is climate change, climate adaptation, and that includes renewables. So over the last, year or so, we've been working with the state to try to identify the state's needs in terms of solar development. And one of the things that we've found is that one of the barriers and one of the things kind of holding us back is due to regulation. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, just a little bit about that background, what we're doing and what it looks like so far. I have this nice little placeholder slide to start with. So solar energy is a renewable resource. It's clean and quiet. And the reason I included this, I think a lot of us know what solar is, but one thing that we found in the state is that there's a lot of, hesitation to adopt solar in some areas because of misconceptions about what it is and what it does. There's rumors out there about environmental impacts, runoff that contains toxins or magnetic waves that can affect things. I mean, there's a lot of different pieces of information that are floating around that are not always exactly well-founded. So one of the things we did to start off with when looking into the solar energy regulatory stuff was to try and identify what those myths were and break them down. If you go to cpex.org, you can look at the full list of some of the common misconceptions. But for today, we'll move ahead here and talk about why solar is important right now in Louisiana. One, it's the fastest growing energy resource. Louisiana, I think, is ranked 48th amongst all states right now for clean power, but we have 6 new substations under construction, 5 slated to begin in the near future, I think. There's something like close to 75 potential solar sites under study, and this industry is just growing and growing really rapidly, obviously, for a lot of reasons. So it is important that we're talking about it right now. The energy use is expected to double by 2050, as it says on the slide. And then also the governor's climate action plan that just came out this last year has a goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So that's another thing that's going to propel solar forward, because as we shift away from some of the other energy sources, we're going to shift toward renewables. And I think it's also important to note that although solar is a new resource, Louisiana is an energy state. We've been producing energy. We've been doing this sort of thing for a long, long time. We have great background in the energy industry. So even though this resource is specifically a little bit newer one, wind and solar and this sort of thing, it's not a new for our state. So, don't let these numbers and these increases scare you. This is not new for us. Anyway, but new technologies are improving. So that means that as we get better at harnessing the sun's power, the technologies get cheaper to produce and it's easier to build big farms. More farms are going to want to come in. Obviously, another reason Louisiana has a lot of rural land that could be used for solar. And then the last couple bullets here are about the regulatory background. A lot of states are starting to realize that they need to have rules in place for where solar goes and when and how. So that's what we're working on. That's what CPEX is working on with the DNR. How solar is generated. I just put a quick slide in here to talk about the cells and PV panels, just to get us all on the same page. Solar panels are made up of individual cells. You have the little cells, those come together to make a panel. More panels make an array, and an array can be something as big as just going on the roof of the house. That would be the rooftop solar.
Kate, sorry, I can't hear you. I'm not sure if others are having problems hearing you.
Oh,
You're back. We can hear you.
that's so peculiar. I didn't do anything. You can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. How much did we miss? The whole thing?
Just maybe like 4 or 5 seconds.
Okay. So the sizes of the solar things, the solar arrays in the world that we're working in the zoning and regulatory world, we have 3 scales. So there's obviously other scales when it comes to these little tiny panels that are portable, but what we work with are the rooftop solar, which can also include solar panels on top of a carport or by the side of a house sometimes, or in the backyard. It's just like a smaller kind of residential scale. Then there's community scale, that's the solar gardens, and that's something that's not got a lot of momentum in our state yet, but that a lot of people are really interested in, obviously because of the cost savings and the benefits to smaller communities. The ability to have solar going into your community without having to make that purchase yourself is a really huge advantage of the community scale solar, the solar gardens, and then the utility scale solar farms are the really big ones. And the utility scale is where most of the regulatory action is happening right now. That's where we're needing to really focus, because those are the ones that have this huge impact, obviously, on the land nearby. When you put in all this huge array in there, it's going to impact how the land looks and is used. So getting into the meat of sort of what I wanted to talk about was how and why solar goes into where it goes. There are a lot of factors that go into this, and Andy's going to spend a little time talking about the specifics of connecting to the utility and the grid and the larger energy system. But to start off with, there has to be land that's available. Like I said, in Louisiana, we have a lot of rural land. The land has to be sort of flat, somewhat flat. It can be graded, but then that brings a whole new set of challenges, because the grading can affect the environment. So it's not always something they want that's feasible for the solar developer. It has to, as far as other environmental requirements, there can't be like endangered species on the land. There can't be, so it has to meet certain flood and water impact requirements. And then solar farms need to be able to be connected to the grid, meaning that it has to be close enough to a substation or a major transmission line to make it feasible to actually pump the energy out of the solar farm into the community or to whatever it is powering. So that's a really important factor. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is because sometimes when we see the solar farms popping up and we see these numbers about things doubling by 2050 and whatnot, it can be easy to start thinking like, oh God, these farms are going to come up everywhere. The whole land's going to be covered in solar panels. And this is just to say that that's really not as much of a concern as we think, because there are enough constraints that it's not possible to put them everywhere. The grid either doesn't have the lines in a certain area, and it's not feasible, feasible to put in a new substation, or the land isn't flat. We have a lot of land that floods. We have a lot of wetlands. There are a lot of things like that that factor in, that I think Andy will get into too. So there are a few different ways that we are approaching siting regulations. So with those environmental constraints in mind, we have to think about, I guess, creative ways to make sure that the land we're using is being used to the best that we can, the best ability that we have to get the most out of it. And sometimes that means co-uses, like these creative site solutions, putting solar panels over parking lots, doing agriculture under the panels. But a lot of the time, what it really means is making sure that the communities that are looking at maybe having a farm come in know what the other options are for that land. So they're not seeing a big swath of land and saying, this is empty land, we're not using it right now, let's just bring in a farm. They're actually weighing that against the possible other uses. So what CPEX has been doing is looking at the type of regulation that's needed to make sure they have those tools. They have access to the environmental analysis tools online, that there's enough information out there on what other possible development opportunities are in the area. Are there other industries that maybe we want to bring in, that we want to focus on? Really, it's just trying to shift away from grasping and thinking like, well, let's grab the solar right now and just get it in, to really thinking like big picture. Is this something for the long term? Is this something that's really going to benefit us? A couple other creative solutions that we've seen have been, oops, yeah, thank you. Someone skipped a slide, but we want to go one forward. There we go. The solar panels over canals, which is a really cool thing that could happen in Louisiana. This picture is a rendering of one in California, but basically thinking about it as a double duty tool for deflecting the sun from the water, so we don't have things evaporating. In California, this is a problem because of drought. And then second, water also draws sun, so you have reflection from the sun that can attract more sunlight to the panels and make them more effective. And then it's also, harnessing the solar power to pump into the area. And then finally, building integration was the last one that I included in this little slide deck, and that's solar panels that are part of the envelope of the building. And this is a little more complicated, and it's not really, the technology is not really common yet, but it's something that we're seeing emerge, where the kind of electrical grid stuff is built into the building such that we can have the panels on it and have them be powering, say, that building. A lot of the time right now, you'll see some of the big Amazon, Walmart, some of these big corporations putting in solar rooftops to power the warehouses or the manufacturing places. And that's a really great way to go too. But this building integration is a newer version of that. So from here, I think that where we're looking at going as a state is moving toward a lot of collaboration. We're going to have to make sure that cities are talking to other cities, parishes are talking to other parishes, and we're all talking across the state. So it's going to require a lot of coordination. And I think that's one of the reasons that the regulatory stuff is so important. And if we have sort of one toolkit that we can all go to, and we know sort of we have one place we can look for all our resources, what do we need to pull into a cost benefit analysis to make sure this is a good investment, how is this going to affect us, then that ripples outward, and we're all sort of using the same set of requirements and metrics to make the decision about where the solar goes, and that ends up leading to hopefully a system instead of little individual things that aren't working together. I think that's pretty much all I had to talk about for now. And I know that leaves a lot of holes, but that's just to get the conversation started, and hopefully you'll have questions so we can get a little more in depth.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kate. I think you definitely kind of teed us off well and touched on some issues that the next panelists are going to, start diving into. So our next guest is Stephen Wright, who is joining us from the Gulf States Renewable Energy Industry Association. And as Kate was saying, there's definitely some policy aspects that can also impact, the barriers to renewable energy. And so Stephen's gonna start to talk about that with us. So thank you for joining us, Stephen.
Thank you very much for having me. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what we're calling the impact of optics on the renewable industry. My name is Stephen Wright. I'm the executive director of the Gulf States Renewable Energy Industry Association. We are the trade group for solar, wind, and storage for the Louisiana and Mississippi territories. So we focus mainly on policy at the PSCs and at the legislature, but also as Kate so aptly framed up, there's so much of this that is about what goes on at the local level that we work very closely with stakeholders there too, as there's a significant need and technical assistance in all areas of this as we continue to see this industry kind of grow. On the next slide, I think we can get into let's see. Oh, yes.
Even you should have control now. There you go. Great.
Perfect. Thank you. I want to start off with just kind of an overview of industry obstacles that we see. And what do we mean when we say that the optics are a barrier to renewables? Kate touched a little bit on competitive misinformation. We see a broad swath of things that are driven from various realms. We'll get into a lot of those in more detail in a minute, but those come from the trade side, competitors, industries that are concerned not about competition in directly and for energy markets, but also for land and other areas. Job training policy is another way that we can see a lot of optical barriers, a lot of ways that Louisiana can say we're, quote, not open for business. We'll get into that in detail as well. Anti-renewable tax policy is a place that is probably the one that people have seen the most of. This is where you see energy markets picking winners and losers, focusing more on traditional resources or focusing more on resources that they feel are best suited for their community, or by different calculations they feel to create more jobs. And so this allows them to place the incentives in different buckets, which leave renewable projects at a competitive disadvantage. Lastly, there's going to be the investment rhetoric that we're seeing. Before we get into kind of how all that works, the overall things that you're seeing in the markets are things that speak to what can private investors come in and do in these markets. What are there things that the government should be permitting them to do versus disincentivizing them to do, and how does that affect the renewable market? Specifically, let's start with competitive misinformation. The first of those is agricultural trade land use concerns. We heard a couple of those examples already. We look at the arguments that start off with, we don't want to take too much agricultural land out of circulation for that market. The statistic that we like to give is that if you take all of the utility scale solar in the state of California, you were to bundle it up currently and you were to drop it in the state of Louisiana, it would monopolize about the equivalent of 1% of Louisiana's agriculturally stable farmland. So you can see very quickly that this is not a real concern, but is certainly one that is a valid fear. And it's something that we spend a lot of time working on education for. We see a lot of discussion around how land use issues can be impacted from a environmental, wildlife standpoint, everything from the impact on potentially cypress marshland to runoff. We hear a lot of concerns about pollution being an issue. Those are the pollution side. We also continues to get into trade land use concerns, with a lot of the focus being on misinformation around the damaging of the soil underneath the panels, the effects of non-native grasses on pollinators, which also impact local communities. These are all things that best practices have been addressing for some time now in the industry, but we continue to see kind of social media and marketing communication trends looking to push out there mostly unfounded impacts in those areas. On the land value and environmental impacts directly, we have started to see a lot of concern with aesthetic concerns about this. We see a lot of misinformation about the correlation between that and property values. There's a lot of things pushed out to scare people in residential communities that it will significantly impact their property values. We see a lot of misinformation around flooding related to large-scale solar developments. Everyone's heard when you're discussing barriers to renewables, we've all heard the old misinformation about wind turbines killing birds, et cetera, things like that as being a significant problem. We recently have seen a lot more discussion about what we call solar flaring on solar farms, the people being a lot of misinformation put out there about the intensity of glare and radiation as a result of those reflections. So those are all things that we battle. One thing we specifically see as well in Louisiana is natural disaster concerns. As you saw recently in Florida, with a major hurricane there, that we can build resilient and hurricane, if not proof, hurricane resistant large-scale solar facilities. We saw quite a success with some of those developments in that latest disaster. We get a lot of questions about solar panels being blown off during hurricanes, equipment being damaged beyond repair. There's also a lot of misinformation out there around sites that have been hit by natural disasters, or sites that have been hit by man-made disasters or economic disasters being abandoned. So we have spent a lot of time fighting back against all of those things. Next, I'm going to talk a little about job training policies. What we see in various markets that have made these policies a barrier is the job training in general and federal and regional funding authorities are often used as a political football. We see when one party or one particular interest is in charge, we'll often find that they will embrace federal and regional funding for some industries and refuse it in others. One of the most controversial ones in Louisiana that has come back around in the last several years that made national news was there were several states that were offered high-speed rail funding at one point from one administration, and for one reason or another, governors and local agency authorities chose to not accept those funds. Well, we see some of that within the renewable industry as well, turning away direct dollars that can be used for site improvement, that can be used for infrastructure and transmission, some of the things that Andy will get into. Also, regional industry pressure. Oftentimes, we'll have your local community colleges, your universities, your technical college programs that have for a long time developed curriculum and been pipelines for traditional energy sources, and also have received a lot of private dollars over the years from those industries, will be pressured to not open new programs. They'll be pressured to stick to the programs that they're currently being supported with. We've also seen where, what I'll get into the third piece of this, you see the term curriculum dilution, where you just, in most industries, what happens is you work with your corporate partners, you find curriculums that meet their job needs, and you deploy those training programs. Curriculum dilution is when you pretty much see, especially at the state level and local level, politics pushed into the curriculum, saying, well, while you're learning while you're learning solar and wind training, we're also going to make sure that it focuses on carbon sequestration as well, and therefore, but it's still a 6-month program, so you're really ending up with less training and a less quality curriculum for some of those people who are looking to retool and go to work in these various industries. So all of these tend to impact growth as well. Anti-renewable tax policy. The largest example that we see in our region is we in Louisiana have an industrial tax exemption program. This is a program that is a state-funded program with some regional local oversight that focuses on attracting large-scale industry projects for areas. It requires a vote at multiple levels. It has been very effective at bringing in a lot of industry into a lot of sites that before that had not been able to really draw much attention. Solar sites have started taking advantage of this program, what we call the ITEP program. We've had legislation in the last 2 or 3 years attempting to remove renewables from being eligible from this program. That comes in 2 pieces. Some industries are frustrated that they aren't eligible in ITEP and that renewables are. And then the other piece of that is, like we talked about, the goal is for some folks to send the message that Louisiana is closed for renewable business, and pushing renewables out of that program is a good way to show that. Luckily, our legislature has seen through this every year and pushed back pretty heavily and broadly on putting us in an anti-business climate. Sales tax interpretations is another thing that we see locally, where you're a developer and you would normally be receiving various sales tax benefits in regards to your development. If states have often weaponized this and localities to be able to soak a development and sales tax that they weren't expecting, because the general interpretation would not have applied for some of those components in sales tax, and so it ends up inflating the price of projects, therefore being a barrier. The third piece is payments in lieu of taxes, called pilots. For example, one project currently in Louisiana is partially on higher education land. It's connected to an LSU agriculture program. And therefore, since it's on that land, that is property tax exempt land. So then you get into the dynamic of, if localities that feel that they're not receiving their fair share of revenue since it's on exempt land. And so then you see a lot of pressure for these payments in lieu of taxes, which is, for lack of a better framework, it's a voluntary property tax. And so when you see this curveball thrown in after a project is well into design and development, this often can be a barrier that changes the decision to locate a site in a certain area. The last piece I want to talk about on this is investment rhetoric. So the most famous piece of this so far, currently there's a lot of discussion about who the Louisiana Treasury can utilize to invest their money in regards to private hedge funds and private portfolio managers. BlackRock, for example, has policies that state that they are focusing more on a renewable portfolio and removing away from traditional energy. This is not something that developers who are focusing our markets are necessarily pressing or involved in, but these policies do impact their ability to get funding based on that market perception. For example, with BlackRock, our Treasury has said that they will no longer utilize their funds. Also, our retirement funds have fallen into those same categories. Therefore, when we see this type of move by large-scale public money, it can have a chilling effect on private money. overly burdensome securitization of in-state renewable investment. That's a complicated line, and but what it really sinks into is, for example, you have to have what we call decommissioning bonds. If you're going to do a development for a large-scale solar farm or wind, you've got to be able to protect the landowner rightfully. That if something should happen, or whenever the development retires, that there will be money there to disassemble and clean up and return the property to its natural state. We've battled with that issue complexly over the last 2 legislative sessions here in Louisiana. There's been work to make the securitization requirements here out of market, therefore making it very difficult to deploy assets and developments in Louisiana when they can go elsewhere and not have to have such overly burdensome securitization well and above what would normally be needed in a market. So this is another barrier that sits out there. Finally, the exclusion of renewable investment from venture capital incentives. Will we see things like in many states R&D tax credits or angel investors, or things that focus around bringing in private outside capital? We're seeing those crafted in various markets, especially in the Southeast, in ways that make renewable energy an ineligible category, even if they fit into the overall innovation mold of those private investment funds. So these 3 bullets that we're seeing here, really the crux of this is that when we see public and private dollars leveraged against an industry, it creates a strong barrier which makes developers choose other markets over ours over and over and over again, which gets back into the dynamics that Kate pointed out about being 48th in the market so far. I know we're leaving the Q&A to the end, so that is really my overview of the barriers from an optics standpoint. All the stakeholders on this phone call are doing incredible work to make sure that all around the nation and internationally, that developers know that Louisiana is open for business, and that we do see a future in renewable energy. And like Kate said, we are an energy state with an energy legacy, and we have the tools here and the people here to do it. So the goal is to break through these barriers and to keep moving forward. And I'm excited to get your questions, and I appreciate the chance to visit with everyone today.
Thank you, Stephen. I definitely have a bunch of questions for you. That was really interesting. So up next, we have Transmission Director, Andy Kowalczyk. So Andy will be talking about some of the issues that have already kind of been hinted at as to why we don't have more renewables here. So Andy, you should be getting access to the PowerPoint now. It looks like,
yeah, let me give it a shot, see if I
okay,
can advance.
Sure.
Yes, I see that at the bottom. Thank you, Yvonne. So my name is Andy Kowalczyk. I'm the Transmission Director for the Southern Renewable Energy Association. We are a industry-led initiative that promotes responsible use and development of wind, solar, energy storage, and transmission in the South. I read that again last night, and I realized that doesn't really tell you a lot about like what the industry-led portion of that is, but we basically represent wind, solar, energy storage, and transmission developers throughout the Southeast. That territory includes Louisiana, as well as Southeast Texas and Mississippi and Arkansas, in this larger construct called the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. And I'm just going to talk about one portion of what the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, I'll call it MISO for short, does. And I'll continue with the next slide. I do want to kind of frame this presentation, though. This is more of a broad overview, kind of a beginner's kind of dive into what's really kind of a complex topic. So I don't want to scare people off. I want to kind of relate this to the barriers that are kind of keeping renewable energy from thriving in Louisiana. But I do want to point to the screen cap in the corner of the screen right there, what this is this is a map that shows the contours of that MISO that I was talking about. And all those little dots are projects that are prospective projects that are applying to get connected to the grid. And if you look in a little bit closer, you'll see the solar, all the yellow dots. Those are all representing solar projects that are trying to connect to the grid. And all the blue ones with flame in them, that represents natural gas. So what you can see right away is that solar and these gray lightning bolts as well, those are energy storage. So all these dots in the south are basically renewable energy projects. There's only one natural gas project. But what I want to do with this presentation is familiarize the audience with what's needed to connect large renewable energy and battery storage projects. This is kind of from an engineering standpoint. This isn't going into everything else. Kate did a really great job of explaining what the siting issues are, and Stephen talked about a lot of the policy barriers that are really in our way and just like clouding the media sphere with disinformation. I'm talking about something that actually needs to happen before these projects connect to the grid. And I want to present some of the specific challenges that we're facing right now in Louisiana related to this. And I want to also kind of offer an explanation of what's needed to fix the grid in Louisiana so that renewable energy can be built in the state. So first of all, I want to make the connection. Well, what's the context for this whole thing of connecting renewables to the grid? What I have here is a graph that's founded on information from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories, as well as the levelized cost of energy that talks about, the amount of time that it takes to construct renewables on average, and the amount of time that it takes to connect them to the grid through studies that are undertaken every year. This is a routine process that's done by utilities or grid operators to make sure that these connections to the grid are reliable, and they select the right upgrades to electrically connect them to the grid. The length of time needed for this study can vary a lot based on how challenging it is to connect to the grid, how many upgrades are triggered through the study. And in Louisiana, this process is managed by MISO rather than Entergy. It's typically a process that's run by the big utility, and they look at applications from developers to determine what those upgrades are. A lot of times this can be something that happens in a black box. We work in the Southeast as well, and we have a lot more limited information about what it takes to connect projects to the grid. And a lot of times there can be lengthy holdups before projects can come out of a study and have an idea of what it takes to connect the grid. And time is very much money for a lot of these projects, which I'll get into a little bit more about what's happening in MISO and why time is money, and that results in a lot of projects actually withdrawing from the grid. But you can see on this grid on this chart clearly that the big barrier here is the blue for utility scale solar, onshore wind, and offshore wind. It takes the most time to determine what the upgrades are and go through this interconnection process. The sliver of orange is actually, what takes relatively a lot less time, certainly less than nuclear on the far left. So I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail because there's a lot of words here, and it's a diagram that probably makes everybody want to go to sleep while they're looking at it. But I am going to do kind of a high level on this. How does this work? So say you have a 100 megawatt solar farm that you want to develop. First of all, you have to prove that you have site control, which means that you have the means to lease a plot of land and you have an idea of where that is. And then you pay a deposit for this study that MISO undertakes. And then, phase one starts, you put a little bit more money down to ensure a spot in this interconnection queue. And MISO looks at, what kind of impacts this injection of power has on the grid. and then they determine what kind of grid upgrades are needed in order to reliably connect it to the grid. This is kind of like a broad overview, the first part of it. The second part of it is a revision on that model, and they request, more of a down payment to continue on to the study. And the final part of that looks at, neighboring systems and their impacts on neighboring systems. And then it pulls all of that data together for a final revision. And then the final revision is the result of that is a signed agreement with MISO, or, possibly if the costs are too high, a developer will actually leave the queue. And this is kind of the thing that I'm talking about right now. Renewables are really queuing up. This is in MISO, there are more renewable energy projects than have ever been trying to connect to the grid in history. Louisiana had the second highest amount of renewables enter into the queue just this last year in 2022. And Arkansas was the first highest that entered into the queue. So it's very interesting considering that there are a lot of northern states that are part of MISO, but Louisiana and Arkansas had by far way more renewable energy projects entering into the queue than anywhere else in the footprint. And that's all great news. So, going back to the title, this is like when in a movie where they say the title. What's the holdup with this whole thing? Well, the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory did a study just recently, and they found that states like Texas and Louisiana had the greatest interconnection costs among projects of any other state aside from North Dakota. So what happens when, these are sometimes lengthy and complicated projects and time is money? And then on top of this, there are very costly interconnections, is that a lot of projects leave the queue. And so this becomes a significant barrier to connecting renewable energy in Louisiana. And there's numbers behind this. Some partners that we work with from the Sustainable FERC project compiled a lot of these numbers directly from MISO and their interconnection queue. From 2016 to 2020, there were 10,000 gigawatts, which is, a pretty large number of projects that left the queue in Louisiana during those 4 years. Just too costly for developers to develop projects in Louisiana. So the question is what's causing this? Lengthy interconnection studies and very complex upgrades are needed. What's triggering this, and what can we do about this? How do we fix this? So not everybody is connecting to this, all the time. But I think this is the overarching narrative in this time in history where there is, massive investment and massive expansion plans for renewable energy on the federal level as well. The Inflation Reduction Act that was just passed by Congress is looking at 50% emissions reduction by 2030. What that means, due to a Princeton repeat project, Princeton is they have this project that looks at a lot of different dimensions of how to get to net zero by 2050. They recently did an analysis on the Inflation Reduction Act, finding out that in order to meet that 50% reductions by 2030, we really can't do it without ramping up to a 2% transmission expansion per year over what we're already doing right now. And these graphs are just kind of highlighting that, without this expansion, you get to 5,000 terawatt hours per year. And then with it, with 1% and so on towards 2% per year. So this is really something we need to make federal policy thrive right now. But MISO is actually working on this. This is another one of their roles, is that they want to make sure that these projects can connect affordably and provide us as consumers with affordable and reliable renewable energy, or lowest cost resources in their words. But it's just a commonly understood fact that renewable energy is the cheapest resources on the market. So what they're doing right now is they're engaging in something called the Long Range Transmission Plan, or, as it says, Long Range Transmission Planning under the Reliability Imperative. Now, the root, reason for doing this is to maintain reliability in the future. It's not just to connect renewable energy projects. It just so happens that the market is choosing renewable energy projects. And so this is needed, a larger transmission planning effort to ensure regional reliability. And they've delivered on this in just the last year. In late 2020, MISO launched the Long Range Transmission Plan to make sure that the grid's more reliable for the next 20 years in the future. And the first set of projects in the North have already been approved in July of 2022. Now, what consumers are getting for this is for a $10.4 billion investment across these states that you can see on the screen cap to my right, is a $37 billion return. So this is basically 2.6 benefit to cost ratio. So for every dollar that's spent, $1.60 is returned into the pockets of ratepayers and consumers. So pretty great deal. In addition to making the grid a lot more affordable and reliable, though, it also enables about 53 gigawatts of wind, solar, and battery storage, because it's lowering that complexity of connecting to the grid. It's ensuring that there's more capacity on these transmission lines so that there is a lot less of, engineering around, the corners to make sure that things are reliably connected on a lower voltage grid. MISO is currently working on one more set of lines in the North before moving to the South in 2023, but they do have plans for the South and Louisiana. And here is kind of the draft plan for moving ahead on this. So here you see tranche one. That's that's what I just showed right there in the previous slide. And then they're moving on to tranche two, which will also be in the North, and they're looking at a more advanced expansion of resources. They're actually including the IRA bill and a lot of the inceptions about price and affordability of different resources. And you'll see a lot more renewables actually brought online by that tranche two. And then they'll be looking at tranche three and tranche four in 2023, 2024, 2025 kind of time horizon in the next couple of years. So what can Louisiana do about this? What is the relation between decision makers and this process? So both the Louisiana Public Service Commission and the New Orleans City Council have important roles in LRTP planning, as well as in MISO. They're state regulators, and they regulate the utilities that are a part of MISO. And, they make decisions about affordable rates in the states and about generation decisions, as well as, about ultimately the transmission and grid improvements that get built in a state. So in Louisiana, it's Commissioner Craig Green that represents for the Louisiana Public Service Commission, and Councilman J.P. Morrell represents the city of New Orleans, because the city of New Orleans regulates the local utility. But as the Q numbers show, that I showed, their historic numbers, in Louisiana is only the second largest, has the most renewables in the queue of anywhere else in MISO. all of the Louisiana Public Service Commissioners have an important role in getting LRTP and renewable energy built in the South. And I think that this is an interesting fact. Most people would not think that, one of the more conservative representatives on our Louisiana Public Service Commission would have the most renewables of any of the other commissioners in the state, but that is very much the fact with Commissioner Mike Francis. Part of that's because there's a lot of land out there, but also he's been generally very supportive of renewable energy being developed in his district. So I think that's all of my slides. Actually, I did have a broader appeal, and that is, if anybody wants to engage more in this topic or wants to, organize with others, it's something that I engage in quite a bit. Southern Renewable Energy Association is with something called the environmental sector. That consists of a lot of NGOs that are of the environmental persuasion or works on climate issues or renewable energy. And we engage directly in MISO meetings to ensure better climate outcomes and better renewable energy expansion outcomes. But I also host monthly calls for folks in the South that are interested in the same sort of thing as expanding renewables and getting big wins and getting more affordable resources online in the South. But that's my contact info. Strongly encourage folks to reach out to me. I love talking about this stuff. I love my job. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was great. And we can kind of share that information with attendees about that monthly call and just plug your information when we send out the recording. So we have now heard from all of our panelists, and I don't know about y'all, but I found all of it fascinating, and I have a ton of questions, but I'm going to start off with one for Stephen and anybody else who wants to chime in. So when we talk about these barriers, I'm just wondering how can constituents and just regular everyday citizens send the message that they want pro-renewable energy policies in Louisiana? So Stephen, would you like to answer that one?
Absolutely. And I think there's two pieces to that where people can really bring the most value to that conversation. The first is, don't hesitate to just directly reach out to your public service commissioner, to your local legislator, and be candid about whatever it is that is the true value that a renewable brings in your mind, whether that be access for more environmentally friendly products, but also talking about the jobs that it would invest in your community, or how if revenue from those projects being able to assist in growing schools or healthcare infrastructure or roads in your community, if that's what's important to you, share that specifically with why it's a priority to you. Because often enough they hear, we want to have renewable energy, but it's the motivations that really move our policymakers. The second thing that I would put out there is, when you see all the misinformation out there, please, push back against it when you see it on social media. Lord knows nobody wants to get in a fight on social media. No one ever wins. But putting out your own information, that's the clear information. Kate referenced earlier that they have some great resources on the CPEX website for this. I'm also happy, all my contact information is here below, to send primers to anyone who want to see what the answers are to a lot of these things that we see circulate out there in the media and online. But being an individual advocate and just putting true information out there is just as valuable as any other type of political influence in the process. And I really think that that's something that everybody can do to help solve these problems.
Thanks, Stephen. I'd love to add to that too. I think that's absolutely right. And I would just also say that it can be easy to think that someone else is saying these things out loud, that someone else is going to council meetings, that someone else is going to town halls. But a lot of the time, the people that are showing up at those sorts of events are the people that have a really strong stake in preventing the renewables. And other people need to be there too. You know, I think we think, especially if we're in one of these echo chambers where our world is a lot of people that thinks like us, we know all our people and all our friends are talking about this. So we assume, oh, everyone must know. Well, they don't, you know, people really don't know. So it is important for someone to be there to talk about these things, just like Stephen was saying, even if it's as little as Facebook. With like is there a setting on Facebook where you can't allow people to respond to your comment? I feel like that's the only way to safely do a Facebook post, but I don't know, I don't have it.
If I could just add to that too, I think that, you know, sometimes getting into some of these rooms, it can be a little bit intimidating for folks. But I will say that, you know, just coordinating with others and remembering that your voice is always valid, regardless of whether you are the smartest person in the room or not. I think that is always a good thing to keep in mind. And I think that a lot of the public processes sometimes can be designed to instill that fear and that intimidation so that people don't feel like their points are valid. So, I mean, that's kind of where I come in on this.
Great, thanks y'all. So we now have a question from the audience. The first question is, has Commissioner Lambert-Boissiere been supportive of renewable energy? Anybody want to answer that one on the panel?
I can't speak to the commissioner specifically, but we have worked really closely with the Public Service Commission, and I can say that there's it's a mixed bag. You know, people do want the state to move forward and people do want to see good results. And the thing that I think complicates the issue is that there are a lot of hands pulling different strings when it comes to regulation on these things. The PSC does some things, DNR does some things, the Department of Fish and Wildlife does some things. And, you know, one of the things that's going to hopefully remedy and make things a little bit easier for them to do what they need to do, move things forward in a safe way for the state, is going to be having a consistent set of local regulations. So we do have support from the PSC on the model solar ordinance, at least, which is a really great thing. And a lot of the commissioners are in favor. I don't know if Andy or Stephen know more about the commissioners specifically.
Well, I will say that our commission is, without getting into naming specific commissioners, is pretty strongly interested in utility scale renewable. We've really seen a strong majority support for solar farms and a significant interest in utility scale wind. Obviously, things get a bit more dicey when you get into things like rooftop solar and community solar, simply because those are, at times, can be more complex policies, and how those impact utilities, how those impact local communities require a lot more debate and discussion typically. So we do see more of a divergence amongst the commission in that category. Specifically to Commissioner Boissiere, I'll say he has been a consistently solid vote when matters have come up before the commission that have been reliably pro policy for renewables. We'd like to see all of the commissioners bring more of those topics up so that there can be an opportunity for vote. That's something that we as GSREIA have pushed heavily to see more dockets so that we give commissioners the opportunity to support us.
Thanks, Stephen. And thank you for your question, Harper. The next question is, what rules or regulations has the state of Louisiana passed in recent years, if any, to promote offshore wind?
I can speak. Kate, do you want to go first or me?
No, go ahead. I was just going to mention the Department of Natural Resources working on something right now, but I'll let you take it.
No, you go ahead with that, and that's the better piece than what I'm going to tell. So go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So this is a really great time because to be having this webinar, because there's so much in the works. They've realized the need for someone to be overseeing these things and making sure that everything can happen in a good way. So the Department of Natural Resources right now has this model solar ordinance thing underway. They are working on a decommissioning thing, which is what we were talking about earlier about making sure the land is usable after a farm has gone in. The decommissioning is what makes sure that it gets brought back to a good state of use, which is pretty common practice. It's nothing unusual, but we're making it a state policy now. And then they also have this wind one. And I think the wind policy they're working on is something about the way the leases work or the royalties. And it's something about 3 miles offshore is state waters. And so it's about the offshore leasing. And it's supposed to be done in, I think January is the deadline right now. And I'm not sure if that's for feedback or the final draft.
Yeah, to piggyback on what Kate said, we saw a couple of bills during this last legislative session looking to kind of crack the nut on what revenue sharing and what infrastructure investment needs would be like from a regulatory standpoint on offshore wind for our region. So some of that passed, some of it did not. Like she said, Department of Natural Resources is exploring it heavily. There was a bill that did not pass by Representative Joe Ogeron that would have pressed for the Public Service Commission to perform a pilot on offshore wind in the region, but it was still a success because with that pressure from the legislature and just that interest, we saw Commissioner Craig Green put forth a directive in a recent commission meeting requiring that the utilities model offshore wind in their currently going on integrated resource plans. So what that means is that they have to basically do a cost versus value analysis on offshore wind and project that out over 20 years and present that to the commission. So that's exciting as well.
Yeah, thank you, guys. We have one more question from the audience, and this question is for Andy. So Andy, when you were talking about interconnection costs, I think you said that Louisiana had some of the highest interconnection costs. What is driving the prices and making those interconnection costs so high?
That's basically the whole presentation. So what's driving these costs is that underinvestment in the transmission system. This is the bulk power system. This is where big renewable energy projects connect to the grid so that they can transmit this grid or this power all the way to your house, into cities across Louisiana and throughout the entire US, basically. But when you only have limited capacity, you can only accommodate limited requests. So when there are a ton of requests, it triggers a lot of upgrades. And these upgrades go into the high voltages. The higher the voltage, the more cost, the more impacts that these high voltage lines cause on the system when you're connecting more power. And these impacts also flow down system too. You can almost think about it as like a water pipe. If you have a very tiny hose and you try to connect a fire hose to it, you're going to need a lot to be able to accommodate that water that's being flowing into it. So it's incredibly complex. That's kind of a rough analogy, but everybody used that with water and electricity. So I thought it kind of fits. But basically, that's the issue, is that without a reasonable amount of capacity and voltage in the system, then it's going to cost a lot to connect renewable energy projects. It's like a green premium. And the problem with that is a market problem. So that's just sending a market signal that developers don't want to connect to the South. A big reason why we do have so many requests, though, in the South right now is because there was a big transmission plan up north, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. So, the intention to develop the South in a way that the North was developed, that sends a big signal. Just MISO showing that they are moving ahead with things and they are actually planning for the future, and they do intend to plan in the South.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. It was really exciting to see, some good news in Louisiana, just in that we do have, a lot of renewable energy that wants to do its job if it can. We have two more questions from attendees. The first question is, how does land use affect building transmission lines for renewables? So is there a panelist that wants to answer this one first?
I think Andy may know more about it, but I think we're talking about easements, I guess, possibly. Land use being such a big concept, I don't know exactly where to start with it, but
well, if it helps them, this same person also asked if eminent domain is a barrier.
Okay, so probably like residential land uses and maybe like some urban or suburban core type land uses. And maybe thinking about it in terms of how do we put new lines in and run new transmission lines. I think that would be, big transmission line easement, which is actually probably more of Andy's expertise. But I'll say we do think about it when we're doing city planning and big plans for urban areas. We're always considering how best to lay it out so that these things can go in pretty easily. But Louisiana is an interesting case because a lot of these little rural cities and towns where there's all this like brownfield land or land that would be really great for a solar farm, they don't have a lot of oversight for these types of things. Sometimes they don't even know where all their lines are. They maybe don't have the data on it because they have a really small city staff, and it can be a little bit of a push and pull game. But it definitely requires careful collaboration with the city and with the area, I'll say that, and talking to the public. There's a lot of these places that have really careful rules with really particular rules about how we engage the public and talk about where these things are going into. A lot of Louisiana has, a lot of the overhead power lines for the small lines, so that's out of the way, but the bigger lines are complicated.
It varies. And I mean, I've heard of transmission lines taking 10 years to get built just because there are natural preserves in the way, in the right of way. And there are, there's suit brought against the developers. And then I've heard great stories about, a transmission developer that works with local landowners. And basically through talking to the local landowners, they just find out that they prefer a different kind of tower. Maybe they don't prefer the wide base kind of lattice towers. Maybe they, prefer like a monopole tower because they can, drive their tractor or their lawnmower around it when they're tending to their land. So it's a case by case basis. And I think it's really important to talk to the stakeholders as early as possible in this process. And this is something that we're actually having a lot of internal conversations as environmental groups who are pushing for this transmission expansion. We're talking to a lot of environmental groups and a lot of groups that are centering equity in their conversations about renewable energy expansion and how to begin those conversations while also decarbonizing at large scale. And it's not something that everybody has the perfect answer for yet. And I think it's going to take a lot of work, but I think that, it's a very, very worthy and very important effort to undertake nonetheless.
Yeah, thank you guys. So I think that we are wrapping up our questions. So I've heard a lot of things. I've heard a lot of barriers, but I've also heard some exciting things, some opportunities that we have, for instance, with the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think the one thing that I also am hearing in many of these presentations is just that individuals and regular citizens can engage with this work if they want to see more renewable energy. Getting into those rooms can be a barrier, right? But I think we're all here to support anybody who has questions or who wants to get involved in these different aspects of renewable energy development here in Louisiana. So I think we are kind of coming to an end for this evening. I just want to give panelists a chance to say something. If there's anything you want to say, just to kind of tie up any ideas that you might have presented. Anybody going once, going twice?
Comment on eminent domain real quick. I saw
Yeah,
a
of course.
barrier. I'll just say I haven't really seen eminent domain used for putting in transmission lines. It's usually more of an agreement than a taking. It's not super common.
Great. Thank you, Kate. I think we're gonna wrap up a little bit early today. Thank you everybody for attending. Thank you panelists for spending your evening with us. As I said, I will email this recording to everyone who was registered, and we will house the link to this recording on the Alliance for Affordable Energy's website, and we will also share that on our social media channels. So the recording will be available at all4energy.org, and all of our social media for the Alliance is all4energy. So you can follow us there and find this recording. Thank you all so much for coming and spending your evening with us. We really appreciate it. And hopefully in a couple of years, we can have a presentation talking about how we overcame all of the barriers that we discussed tonight. So thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you, Yvonne.
You're welcome. Bye, y'all.